Ladies and gentlemen, this is a difficult moment for America. Today we've had a national tragedy. Two airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act.
So I know by this point, most every other YouTube commenter out there has talked about September the 11th and the events that followed. And I initially wanted to do that earlier in the week, but I really wanted to take some time and think about it some more. Because as I've grown older and I've seen the world more, my views on the events of that day, the way that I felt about it afterwards, and just the way that the world is in general because of it, have changed drastically. The first thing that most anybody says when they talk about 9/11 is, I remember where I was when I found out about it. And as far as YouTube goes, it's one of the biggest indicators that I'm one of the older people out there on it. Most of the people are talking about how they were in 4th grade, 6th grade, somewhere in middle school, freshman year maybe. But that was homecoming week of my senior year of high school. I was 17. I remember it perfectly. I didn't even know about it initially. The teacher of my first period class always chose not to have the TV on because she didn't want anybody staring at the announcements rather than taking the advanced placement physics class that I was taking part in. So, it was all going on. It was about 7:46 a.m. Central Time when the first plane hit the tower. So this was right before my class. I didn't even know anything about it until almost an hour later. When I got into my homeroom class, I first found out that my homeroom teacher was absent. A friend of mine who I'd known since middle school came out and told us right away that our homeroom teacher was absent, and that was probably the reason that so many things were happening so weird on the East Coast. And then I started to see the footage and started to hear people talk about the fact that a plane had flown into the World Trade Center in New York City. Most of us at the time weren't thinking a whole lot about what was going on in New York City. For the most part, we all thought it was just an accident. There were talks about attacks and other forms of terror that were going on about there, but there was no confirmation about it. It was just a plane crash to all of us at the time, and then more and more things started to roll in. Of course, when we were watching, all that we saw was the Twin Towers, but we learned later that there was the plane crash in Virginia, and there was the plane crash into the Pentagon, and still nobody knew what was going on. By the end of the day, we had all heard the speech that you heard at the beginning of this video. And we all knew that there was terror suspected and almost guaranteed that it was a terrorist attack against the United States. And our world was changing around us, especially in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the country where most of us had barely heard the word Islam prior to any of this happening. Only the most well-connected and the biggest history buffs in our class really knew what Islam was and had ever really talked about it at any point. I was more of a math and a physics geek, so it wasn't really anything that was ever on my radar, so I'd never really talked about it or heard about it. But within the next few weeks, I was going to start getting a crash course in Islam, what it was all about, or at least what the propaganda was about it, and what it meant for our country going forward. The first thing that I should obviously say about the attacks of September 11th are the positives. It was obviously a very big factor in demonstrating American exceptionalism, and that even holds true today. Anywhere else in the world, if you want to attack a country, you either form a militia in a neighboring country that you are allied with and storm the borders, or you drop a big ass bomb onto that country. And that's the way that it happens, and that's pretty much the end of it. We've done it with Syria, we did it with Japan in the past. Europe has been doing it to each other little bit by little bit since the Dark Ages. And that's pretty much how it goes anywhere else in the world. But you can't do that in the United States. If you ever tried a ground assault in the United States, you would be faced with more 12 gauge shotguns, various rifles, handguns, and any other sort of weaponry that anybody can get their hands on before you could ever say, oh my god, what the hell happened? And there's so much air defense out there that it's really hard to drop a bomb anywhere else in this country, no matter how many politicians out there and political rivals and adversaries try to tell us that North Korea or Russia is going to do it to us. I don't really believe there's a way that any other country out there could drop a bomb on this country without it being intercepted and harmlessly blown up in the air. No, in order to attack our country, a terrorist sect that centered around Afghanistan but was essentially stateless had to put people into this country legally, get them acclimated and accustomed to our culture. These people had to be accepted by the people around them, and nobody really had to believe there was anything going on. All of these people had to hide box cutters in their clothing, get onto an airplane, and then take over the airplanes and kill 3,000 people in the process of making a massive attack on many of our landmarks in this country. There are a lot of people out there that say that that was a cowardly attack, and as much as I hate the fact that it happened on this soil, I could never call it cowardly. There was so much planning, and I could call the fact that they all killed themselves as cowardly, but I mean, when there's only one way to do it, they had to be really dedicated to their ideology in order to pull off the attacks that they did. That was not for the faint of heart, no matter how many people in the propaganda media at the time said so. You have officially attacked the best defended country in the history of the world. And most of the countries that surrounded you and funded you paid the price dearly for it. Obviously, all of the terrorists that were involved paid the ultimate price, but that put us into a warlike state for the next decade and put troops into the region. To this day, we have troops into that region, and most of the politicians out there cite the fact that we had a terror attack 17 years ago on this soil, and that's why we need to keep an occupation there. Now, I've done research on and off to try and figure out why these attacks happened. I figured somebody knew by the point that I started researching it back in 2010. And to my surprise, nobody had a real answer about it, but a lot of people had a lot of theories about it. There are people out there that are so tinfoily that they believe that the Bush administration was the one that caused all of this to happen. That's one theory that I don't directly believe. I believe that Bush was an opportunist and he was able to take the event and use it to forward his political agenda and cover up some of the things I'll talk about later. But I don't think he planned it. I think he just took the tragedy and used it to his advantage. The most accepted theory that's going around the internet right now is that the September 11th attacks were orchestrated by an extremist group that mostly centered in Afghanistan that the U.S. armed to deal with the Soviet threat from the Cold War in response to the U.S. and an Air Force base in Oman or Yemen, where the soldiers were desecrating what the Muslims considered to be a holy land. This Air Force base was left over from Desert Storm, so from that logic it would go back to the Clinton era, which I could see. I think some of this goes back to HW, and I think some of this maybe even goes back a little bit to Reagan and Carter. But around the internet, the most widely accepted theories center around this idea. And honestly, I could see it. I don't discount that in the least. Now that we're 17 years later, there are a lot of mixed feelings about the country because of 9/11 and the way that we reacted and pretty much what we did. And I've done a lot of thinking, and I've even taken some of the ideas a little bit further than most of the commenters do, and that's from doing some financial research and just experiencing things as they were going along at the time. One of the most important things to talk about when you talk about the country post 9/11 is unification followed by immediate division. And this is an important thing, especially in the world today. Right after 9/11, I remember it was the most unified our country ever was. We all wanted to get out there and defend ourselves against a bully that had decided to take a sucker punch at our country. And of course, that sucker punch was aimed at the Muslim community. And there was a lot of backlash for that right here in the country itself. But for the most part, at the time, most everybody wanted to get boots on the ground in the Middle East and go and hunt down and snuff out the threat. A lot of people wanted to drop the nukes on the Middle East and turn the entire desert into an entire sheet of glass. But that would have caused even more retaliation among the world stage, especially being so close to Africa, Russia, and the European Union. And that is a part of the problem. Islam is a religion, it's obviously not a race, but for the most part, everybody in the country had suddenly turned against anybody that was of any sort of Middle Eastern descent, except for Israeli, ironically enough. Even some of the Sicilians were starting to get strange looks at the time because the Mediterranean look was kind of common between Middle Easterners and South Italians. Yes, we were incredibly unified, and some of my more left leaning friends have been pointing that out as they try to turn the remembrance of one of the worst days in our history into an anti Trump holiday. But a lot of them need it pointed out to them the fact that we were unified, yes, but we were unified against people with brown skin. I mentioned before that George W. Bush could not stop himself from taking an opportunity to turn a tragedy into an opportunity for him, both to put himself back into a war in the Middle East, as many of the neoconservatives were eager to do as they were coming into the administration, but also to mask the fact that our economy was starting to fail. I remember throughout the 90s, even people as young as age 23, it was really uncommon for them to not own a house. Pretty much, you got out of college and you bought a house at the time. Most of the people that age were getting ready to go into their first marriage, which would usually last 2 to 3 years, and then get a divorce. But for the most part, it was still a financially good time. Going towards the end of the 90s, you started to see that shift a little bit. You started to see more and more people renting, and you never really knew why. Most of the time, people started to say that if you were renting at that age, there was something wrong with you. I don't necessarily believe that's true. I just know that some people fell into hard times. And I even knew some people personally who were still renting well into their adulthood with 2 kids at home. Even though it wasn't completely obvious out there at the time, the economy was starting to crash in 2001. And all of a sudden, that changed, and all of a sudden our economy bounced back just a little bit, and there were some reasons why. The commercial media at the time told us that we really had to go out and buy new cars, new rings. We all had to go out and buy new things because otherwise the terrorists won. If we stopped buying at the time, that meant that the terrorists had instilled enough fear in our hearts that we were going to give up the American dream, which was a complete line of bullshit. Legitimately, after an attack like that, yes, we should have been going out and buying things, but it shouldn't have been cars, diamonds, big screen TVs, or stereo systems. It should have been supplies for the next time there was an attack. As bad as it sounds, we should have been in panic mode at the time, but instead we were being convinced to go out and buy things on credit and hope that we kept our jobs long enough to keep these things and not get them repossessed. The banks were offering loans at subprime at the time, and the crash was just starting, and then all of a sudden, we were in another military conflict. Suddenly, people who had no other job prospects because they were either getting laid off from their jobs or their jobs were going under because they were overspending at the time, had a nice juicy government job where they could go out and send money home for their parents to pay the bills and cover the bills, or put it in the savings account for it to be waiting for them when they came back. The events of September 11th and the war in Iraq that followed did not stop the economic crash that was coming. It just pushed it down the road for 7 more years. And it did even more than that to the American people. The neoliberals and the neoconservatives of the time also used the events of the attack and the patriotism that followed of the white Americans that were voting for them to turn them against their Muslim neighbors and also turn them against their Fourth Amendment rights, enacting the Patriot Act. I don't know enough about this to comment on it, but if you really want to hear some more about that, Styx had a great video about that right on September 11th in the morning. I really recommend you go and watch it. I will have it linked in the description below this video for anybody who would like to go and see it. It's a really good listen, and it really puts a lot of other things into perspective. As all of my classmates sat around me in our pajamas, because it was Spirit Pajama Day for our homecoming week of our senior year, we never knew the fact that this was going to fundamentally change our lives for pretty much the rest of our lives. We had no idea that people were still going to be talking about this 17 years later, and there was no way for any of us to know the fact that this was going to lead to an almost 2-decade war in the Middle East, with hundreds of thousands of people dying, including civilians and our own soldiers. It was very unfortunate that these events made the term "proud to be an American" an empty phrase and an empty catchphrase in order to incite people to give up their Fourth Amendment rights and go out and buy things that they couldn't afford. But this was the reality that we lived in, and these are the consequences that we have to pay for right now as we're still embroiled in this conflict almost 20 years later. I say that I don't know how to feel about September 11th and what we've done since then, because I really don't. I do understand the fact that part of the reason that this happened to our country was the fact that we did leave a small power vacuum in the Middle East, or so say most of the neoliberals out there. But on the other end of it, it's caused the financial crash to be much worse than it initially could have been, and it's left people with PTSD, and it's left our country in a completely Islamophobic state, and it's left the American left with ammunition in order to call people Islamophobic as well. It's made that a talking point of elections when it really should never have been. There were good things that came out of it, there were bad things that came out of it, and I just really don't know how to feel about it. I just remember how I felt while it was going on. And it wasn't pride to be an American, it was genuine fear of what could come for our future. What did you think about the events of September 11th? How old were you when it happened, and where were you when it happened? I always welcome a thoughtful and positive discussion in the comment section below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at EdsBlog Twitter with a 1 in place of the I. Thanks as always for listening to this show and supporting this channel. And remember, never take the words of bloggers, podcasters, or journalists as gospel. Find all the facts and draw your own conclusions. Take care, everyone.
You're always there for me in my best